The morning had started like any other, quiet and slow, until my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something instinct or fate made me answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a legal officer handling my late brother's affairs. Her tone was calm, but carried an urgency that made my chest tighten. My brother and I hadn't spoken in years, yet hearing his name pulled old memories from places I thought I'd sealed shut. She asked me to come in immediately. No details, no explanation, just a request that felt more like a command. The drive to her office was long enough for doubts to gather like storm clouds. Had something gone wrong? Had he left unfinished business? By the time I arrived, my heartbeat echoed louder than my footsteps. When she finally told me why I was there, the world shifted under me. An inheritance, a substantial one. My life, once predictable and shrinking with age, suddenly widened into something unfamiliar. But as I stepped back outside, I had no idea that the real shock was waiting at home, inside my own walls, behind an open window, wrapped in voices that didn't know I was listening. I sat in the notary's office, trying to steady my breathing as she opened a folder with my brother's name typed across the top. Her voice softened when she explained he had passed suddenly quietly, without warning. For a moment, the room felt smaller, pressing in on me as old guilt resurfaced. We had drifted apart, not out of anger, but out of life's slow pull in different directions. Still, hearing he was gone tightened something deep inside me. Then she read his final instructions. He had left everything to me: property, accounts, assets far beyond anything I'd ever owned. And at the bottom of the document was a brief note in his handwriting, almost like a whisper reaching across years of silence. Asterisk, for the brother who never forgot what was right. Asterisk. Those words hit harder than the inheritance itself. Despite the distance, he had remembered who I tried to be. I signed the documents with a trembling hand, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Stepping out into the daylight, I carried more than wealth. I carried a message, a final reminder from a man I once knew well. But the comfort of that moment wouldn't last. Home was waiting, and so was the truth I wasn't meant to hear. Driving away from the notary's office, the world outside my windshield looked the same, yet nothing in my life felt familiar anymore. My brother's properties, homes overlooking the ocean, apartments generating steady income, were now legally mine. At 67, when most people downsize and slow down, I was suddenly handed a future larger than anything I'd planned for. I tried to imagine telling my daughter. She and her husband had been struggling for months, leaning on me more than I liked to admit. Maybe now I could finally help them stand on their own again. Maybe this inheritance could mend what time had worn thin. As I drove through familiar streets, rehearsing how I break the news gently, a quiet sense of hope settled in me. I pictured their relief, the way their shoulders might finally unclench. My modest house came into view, the peeling paint, the tired lawn. I stepped out of the car feeling lighter than I had in years. I thought the hardest part of the day was behind me. But as I walked closer, an open window carried voices I wasn't meant to hear, and every step forward pushed me toward a truth far darker than anything inside that notary's folder. I parked a little farther from the house than usual, wanting a moment to gather myself before sharing the news. The inheritance still felt unreal, too large, too sudden, too life-altering. I imagined walking through the front door. Calling my daughter into the living room, watching surprise turn into relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could give her more than worry and aging advice. But as I approached my home, something felt off. The living room window, normally shut tight against the afternoon heat, was cracked open. I slowed my steps, listening. At first, I thought it was the TV, but the voices were too sharp, too focused. My daughter and her husband. Their tones carried urgency, a strain I hadn't heard before. I should have walked in normally, announced myself. But instinct, the same kind that guided me through decades of cases, told me to stay silent. I moved closer, staying hidden behind the untrimmed bushes I'd been meaning to cut for months. Their words drifted out clearly. Not about dinner, not about errands, but about me. And with every sentence that reached me, the hope I carried home began to collapse, piece by piece. I held my breath as their words leaked through the open window like poison. My daughter's voice, usually warm, familiar, was tight with worry. If he finds out how deep we're in, we're finished. Her husband's tone was colder, steady in a way that sent a chill through me. He won't find out. Not if we stay on track. My fingers curled into the bark of the bush I hid behind. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard, but then his voice cut through the air again. Tomorrow, we get the evaluation done. Once the papers are signed, everything he owns comes under our control. Evaluation, control. I felt the air leave my lungs. They were talking about me, planning something serious. My daughter sounded hesitant. But what if he refuses? He's stubborn. His reply came without hesitation. Then we make sure he doesn't refuse. A silence followed, heavy and chilling. My mind raced, connecting pieces I hadn't known were scattered. The inheritance I thought would save us might have instead pushed them into desperation. And as I stayed crouched in those branches, realizing the danger I was in, one thing became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. I stayed frozen behind the window, every word sharpening into something undeniable. My daughter's voice trembled as she whispered, "I don't want to hurt him. He's still my father." For a brief second, hope flickered in me until her husband answered with a tone that sliced through any illusion. "He's standing between us and the future. We handle this tomorrow, and it's over." Handle, a word people use when they talk about tasks, not human beings. Then came the part that made my pulse hammer in my ears. "The doctor will write whatever we need," he said calmly. "One visit, a little push, and the court will hand us full authority over everything he owns." My daughter didn't object this time. She only asked, "What if he starts asking questions?" "We sedate him." Something mild. Enough to confuse him. Enough to make the evaluation easy. My jaw tightened. My own flesh and blood. Planning to drug me. Planning to strip away everything: my home, my freedom, my dignity. I had spent decades uncovering schemes like this, but never had I imagined being the target of one. And as I backed away from that window, the truth settled like ice in my veins. Tomorrow, they intended to erase me. I stepped back from the window, each breath colder than the one before. The betrayal hit in waves: first disbelief, then anger, and finally a chilling clarity. My daughter, the child I raised through scraped knees and heartbreaks, was now aligning herself with a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and a fortune. I pressed myself against the wall of my own home, listening as they continued, weaving their plan as casually as if they were discussing weekend chores. Her husband's voice carried a certainty that made my skin tighten. Once the paperwork is filed, he won't be able to make a single decision. Not legally, not financially. Everything will belong to us. He said it with confidence, like someone who had done his research. I knew the type people who believed the law could be bent with enough lies and a willing accomplice. My daughter's small, uncertain voice wavered. "Are you sure this is the only way?" His reply came sharp and final. "We're out of time. Debt collectors aren't waiting. If we lose this chance, we lose everything. He's old. He won't fight. Old." The words simmered in my chest. They thought my age made me weak. They assumed a quieter life meant a softened mind. They had forgotten who I was, what I'd spent my life doing. My heart didn't break, it hardened. I wasn't just an aging man living off a pension. I had once dismantled entire criminal rings with less evidence than what I'd heard in the last 5 minutes. Their plan was set for tomorrow. Their confidence was complete. And as I stepped quietly away from that window, one truth echoed through me. If they thought I was helpless, they were about to learn who they were really dealing with. I walked back to my car in a haze, but not of confusion of awakening. Every instinct I had honed over decades in courtrooms surged back to life. The careful listening, the pattern recognition, the ability to dissect lies with surgical precision. Retirement had softened my routine, but it had not dulled my mind. Not like they assumed. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I replayed their words, each one a brick in the case forming inside my head. Sedatives, a compliant doctor, emergency guardianship, seizing control of my assets. They weren't just scheming. They were executing a full-scale fraudulent takeover. If it had been any other victim, any other home, I would have built a prosecution strategy without hesitation. But this time, the criminals shared my dinner table. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Emotion would cloud judgment. I needed clarity, strategy, patience. I had prosecuted men who whispered, plans in dark alleys with less coordination than what my daughter and her husband had just displayed. The betrayal cut deep, but the professional in me began stitching the situation together. Evidence. That was the lifeblood of every solid case. What I'd overheard was powerful but useless without proof. No recordings. No witnesses. Just a father claiming his daughter plotting to drug him. A clever lawyer could twist that into senility or paranoia. So, I told myself the one truth that mattered. Asterisk. I can't stop them until I let them act. Asterisk. If they believed I was oblivious, that was my advantage. Their certainty would make them sloppy. Their urgency would push them into mistakes. For the first time since I'd heard their voices, my pulse steadied. The prosecutor inside me wasn't just awake. He was preparing for trial, and the defendants were living under my roof. By the time I reached the quiet park a few miles from home, the weight of what I had heard settled into something sharp and deliberate. I sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, the kind that had probably witnessed decades of secrets, and let my thoughts line up like pieces of evidence on a courtroom table. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated scheme, crafted by people who believed I was too old, too lonely, too trusting to see through it. I'd pulled out the small notebook I'd carried for most of my career. Its pages had held everything from witness statements to closing arguments. Now it would hold something far more personal. I listed each step of their plan as I understood it. A doctor willing to fabricate an evaluation. A sedative slipped into my drink. Court filings to take control of my estate. A nursing home waiting like a final cage. The list was damning, but it wasn't enough. I needed more recordings, timestamps, physical evidence. A pattern of intent. Something no lawyer could twist or soften. And to get that, I would have to let the plan unfold just far enough for their own actions to trap them. My hand steadied as I wrote the final line. Asterisk, gather proof. Stay silent. Let them think they've won. Asterisk. It was a cruel strategy, and a necessary one. I had spent my life putting criminals behind bars, but never had the defendants share my last name. Never had justice demanded I prepare a case against my own daughter. As the wind rustled the branches above me, I realized what tomorrow would require. Not anger, not confrontation, but performance. And if I played my role well, their downfall would come from their own hands. I drove home slowly, letting the plan settle into place. If they wanted to corner me, I would make sure every step they took became evidence. The house was quiet when I walked in, too quiet. They greeted me with forced smiles, pretending nothing unusual had been said hours earlier. I matched their performances with one of my own, acting calm, grateful, even distracted. They needed to believe I was the same oblivious man they had counted on. Upstairs in my room, I pulled out the small voice-activated recorder I kept from my working days, thin enough to hide, sensitive enough to capture whispers. I'd placed one in the bookshelf in the living room, another near the kitchen where most of our conversations happened. The devices were nearly invisible, disguised among old papers and trinkets. When I returned downstairs, my daughter offered me tea, her hand shaking just slightly. A hint of something cloudy swirled at the surface. I thanked her, pretending not to notice. I knew better than to drink it. Instead, I excused myself moments later, poured the contents into a bottle, sealed it as evidence, and refilled the cup with water to keep up the illusion. From behind my bedroom door, I listened through my connected earpiece as they whispered, believing I slept deeply. "He drank it," her husband said with satisfaction. "Tomorrow will be easy," their certainty echoed in my ears. They had no idea every word was being recorded, every lie preserved with crystal clarity. Tonight, their trap had begun, and so had mine. I waited until their footsteps faded before I emerged from my room again. The mug sat on the nightstand exactly where I'd left it, steam gone, the surface still faintly cloudy. I picked it up carefully, almost tenderly, the way one might handle a weapon left behind by an enemy. I poured a little of the remaining liquid onto a tissue. Its texture thickened instantly, confirming what I already knew. They hadn't hesitated. Not for a second. I placed the sealed bottle containing the original tea inside my desk drawer, marking the date and time in my notebook. No speculation. No assumptions. Just evidence. That was how cases were built slowly, meticulously, piece by piece. Downstairs, I could still hear them whispering through the recording device connected to my phone. "By morning, he'll barely know his name," her husband said. "The doctor will handle the rest." My daughter murmured something softer, almost worried, but not enough to stop any of it. Not enough to protect me. I returned to my bed and lay on top of the covers, fully dressed. My eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel fear, only a cold, focused resolve. The kind that used to settle in me before stepping into a courtroom. The kind that sharpened the mind and silenced the heart. They thought I'd slip into unconsciousness tonight, wander through tomorrow in a fog, unable to defend myself. They thought one cup of tampered tea would erase decades of experience. But as the house fell quiet and their plan moved forward, I remained awake, alert, waiting. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and by morning, the evidence of their intent would be undeniable. Morning crept in slowly, a pale light sliding across the room. I hadn't slept, yet I forced my body to move as if waking from a heavy, drugged fog. When my daughter knocked softly and stepped inside, I blinked at her with calculated confusion. Her expression eased the moment she saw it, the sluggish blink, the hand to my temple, the slight hesitation in my voice. She believed every bit of it. "Dad, remember the appointment today?" she asked gently. Her husband hovered behind her, watching me with the quiet confidence of someone convinced the game was already won. I sat up unsteadily, exaggerating the tremor in my hands. Yes, I think so." My slow movements delighted them. My vulnerability fed their certainty. Downstairs, they guided me through breakfast as if handling a fragile patient. He poured my coffee. She adjusted my collar. Their kindness felt rehearsed, too polished, but it didn't matter. Every word was being recorded. When they insisted on driving me to the checkup, I didn't resist. I moved like a man drifting through clouds, pausing before steps, squinting at bright light, asking small questions that made them exchange satisfied glances. Inside, I was steady, calculating every moment, every breath, every detail that would later become evidence. But outside, I was exactly who they needed me to be: compliant, confused, predictable. They thought I was walking blindly into their trap. What they didn't know was that I was leading them into mine. They settled me into the back seat like a fragile package, my daughter fussing with the seatbelt while her husband adjusted the mirror to keep me in view. I let my gaze drift unfocused toward the window, playing my part with quiet precision. The city passed in a blur, familiar streets folding into unfamiliar ones, each turn pulling us farther from home and deeper into the plan they believed was airtight. Her husband kept his tone light, speaking about breakfast spots and weekend plans, but every word was laced with forced calm. My daughter sat stiffly beside him, wringing her hands in her lap whenever she thought I wasn't looking. She wasn't heartless, just desperate, tangled in choices she'd convinced herself were necessary. But desperation didn't erase intent. As we drove into a worn-down district I hadn't visited in years, my focus sharpened. The buildings grew older, the signs faded. This wasn't a place for legitimate care. It was where people went when they wanted shortcuts, papers signed, questions ignored, truth blurred. A gray sedan followed several cars behind us. I recognized it instantly. Backup. The quiet reassurance that I wasn't walking alone into danger, even if they believed I was. When we finally pulled up to a narrow, aging building with a flickering medical sign, her husband flashed me a rehearsed smile. "Don't worry, it's just a simple check." I nodded slowly, letting them see only the surface-weak, confused pliant. Inside, though, every step forward tightened the net they had woven for themselves. The moment we walked through that door, their plans stopped belonging to them and started belonging to the evidence. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and something older, like dust trapped in vents that hadn't been cleaned in years. My daughter walked close beside me, guiding me by the elbow as if I might collapse without her. Her husband led the way, confidence returning with every step. He'd clearly been here before. He knew which door to knock on, which receptionist to nod at, which forms to ask for without hesitation. The waiting room was nearly empty. A single flickering light buzzed overhead, casting uneven shadows across the peeling walls. This wasn't a place for real medical evaluations. It was a factory for manufactured diagnoses, the kind of establishment that thrived on desperation and secrecy. The doctor emerged quickly, too quickly, his smile wide, his handshake firm. He didn't ask my name, my history, or my symptoms. His eyes flicked to my daughter's husband, and something unspoken passed between them. A deal already arranged. A script already written. I lowered myself into the chair they offered and let my body sag, letting my eyelids droop just enough to mimic confusion. The doctor leaned in with a rehearsed expression of concern. "Do you often feel disoriented?" he asked. I blinked slowly, letting silence hang before murmuring. "Some mornings are harder than others." He nodded eagerly, jotting notes without context or hesitation. My daughter watched with conflicted relief, believing this performance was saving her future. Her husband, however, watched me with triumph. He thought this was the final step, the moment he gained everything and I lost it all. But he didn't notice the small audio device clipped inside my jacket, recording every leading question, every unethical cue, every false assumption. In that cramped, dimly lit office, they believed the trap was nearly complete. They had no idea that with each careless word, they were tightening the noose around their own plan. The doctor continued his shallow questioning, barely looking at me as he scribbled on his clipboard. Each question was designed to corner me: slow reactions, memory lapses, confusion. I answered with carefully measured pauses, enough to satisfy their expectations without slipping into exaggeration. My daughter's husband watched every reaction, confident the evaluation was going exactly as planned. When the doctor finally set his pen down, he spoke with misplaced authority. "Based on my assessment, he's no longer capable of managing his personal or financial affairs. No tests. No real examination. Just a verdict purchased with secrecy and desperation." My daughter let out a breath she'd been holding, and guilt flickered briefly across her face. Her husband, however, reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the desk with practiced ease. The doctor didn't even attempt to hide the exchange. He tucked it into a drawer without breaking eye contact. That envelope, the one holding their hope and my supposed downfall, was the final piece of evidence I needed. Just as the doctor reached for the official forms, a sudden crash echoed through the hallway. The door burst open, the sound sharp enough to freeze every face in the room. Help had arrived. 2 officers stepped into the doorway, their presence filling the cramped room with a sudden, undeniable authority. The doctor stiffened instantly, his hand hovering over the unfinished paperwork. My daughter's husband rose halfway from his chair, shock rippling through the confidence he'd worn all morning. My daughter, she didn't move. She just stared at me, eyes wide, as if the floor had vanished under her feet. One of the officers addressed the doctor first. "We received a report of fraudulent medical activity involving guardianship evaluations. We need to speak with all of you." His voice was steady, practiced, unshakable. The kind of tone I once used when stepping into dangerous rooms. My daughter's husband tried to protest, but his voice cracked. "This is a misunderstanding. We're just here for a simple checkup." The officer lifted a small device, one of the recordings I'd collected. "Is that so?" he asked. "Because we have audio suggesting premeditated intent to declare this man incompetent without basis." My daughter's gaze snapped to me. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked between me, the officers, and the doctor, realizing, piece by piece, that this wasn't the trap they built for me. It was the one they walked into. The doctor attempted to speak, but his excuses collapsed beneath the weight of the evidence. The envelope of cash still protruded from his drawer, its corner visible like a guilty whisper. My daughter's husband shot me a glare, a mixture of frustration and fear. He hadn't expected resistance, much less a counterattack. But my daughter, her expression wasn't anger. It was something far heavier: heartbreak, regret, the dawning realization of what she had almost destroyed. The officers separated us immediately, placing my daughter, her husband, and the doctor in different rooms. I was guided to a quiet office with a single chair and a metal table. The moment the door closed, the weight of everything I had endured pressed hard against my chest, but I kept my spine straight. I wasn't the victim they imagined. I was the witness. One of the investigators sat across from me, recorder already running. "Take your time," he said. "Tell us everything from the beginning." And I did. I walked them through the overheard conversation at my window, the tampered tea, the planned evaluation, the doctor's cooperation, and every detail I had documented. I handed over the voice recordings, the sealed bottle of drug tea, the notes in my journal, each piece a nail sealing the coffin of their plan. As the hours unfolded, I felt something unexpected. Exhaustion, not from fear, but from the heartbreak of recounting betrayal by the people I loved most. Every time I spoke my daughter's name, my voice dipped not in weakness, but in mourning. When my testimony ended, the investigator nodded with solemn respect. "You built this case better than most active prosecutors," he said quietly. "You may have saved your own life." Before escorting me out, he hesitated. "Your daughter, she's cooperating. She's shaken. It looks like she didn't understand how far this would go." His words stung more deeply than anything else that day. Because forgiveness was one thing. Rebuilding trust was another. And I wasn't sure which path my heart could still walk. When the officers finally drove me home, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the street. My house looked the same from the outside, same faded paint, same creaking gate, but something inside me had shifted forever. This place, once a sanctuary, now felt like a graveyard filled with the echoes of whispered betrayals. I stepped inside slowly, half expecting to hear their voices again, plotting behind an open window. Instead, the silence felt heavier than any noise. I walked through each room as if seeing it for the first time. The living room where we'd share birthdays, the kitchen where my daughter learned to cook, the hallway where her laughter once filled the air. How strange, how cruel, that the same walls that held those memories had also hidden there, planned to take my life apart. On the table sat the mug they had handed me the night before. I paused, staring at it not with anger, but with a profound sadness. That cup represented everything I had refused to believe. That love can fracture. That desperation can twist good people into shadows of themselves. I sank into my old armchair, the one my daughter used to curl up beside as a child, and let the truth settle in. Justice had been served, yes. Evidence had protected me, yes. But justice doesn't stitch broken hearts, and evidence doesn't rebuild trust. I wondered where my daughter was now, still in custody, answering questions, grappling with the weight of her choices. I wondered if she blamed her husband or herself, or me for not seeing her struggle sooner. And as the house settled into its night creaks, I understood something painful and permanent. Winning the case didn't mean I hadn't lost something far more precious. The next morning, I received a call from the detective handling the case. His voice was calm but edged with something heavier. "Your daughter has given a full statement," he said. "She admitted everything." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. Admitting the truth wasn't the same as undoing the damage, but it meant she had stopped hiding, at least from the law. Her husband, on the other hand, had tried to bargain, deny, twist the narrative. He blamed financial stress, then blamed the doctor, then claimed I misunderstood the entire situation. But the recordings left no room for lies, and the tampered tea sealed his fate. The doctor, confronted with overwhelming evidence, crumbled quickly. They were all facing charges. When the detective asked if I wanted to provide a victim's impact statement, I told him I needed time. How does a father describe the wound of betrayal without tearing himself apart in the process? I spent the rest of the day moving through the house like a ghost. Every object carried a memory: her childhood drawings, framed photos, gifts she'd made with clumsy little hands. I touched each one as if it were fragile, as if I were afraid it too might betray me. Neighbors knocked, offering concern in polite, distant tones. I thanked them, but I didn't let anyone inside. I couldn't bear the thought of explaining something I barely understood myself. As night settled in, I stood by the window where I'd first heard the whispers that changed everything. I stared into the darkness, realizing that some wounds don't bleed, don't scar. They settle quietly and change the shape of a man's heart. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight brought only silence. The following day, I received a final update from the investigators. The charges were official fraud, coercion, attempted medical deception, and conspiracy. It was the kind of case I would have prosecuted without hesitation years ago. Yet hearing those words now brought no satisfaction. Justice had been delivered, but there was nothing victorious about it. This wasn't a courtroom victory. It was the burial of whatever family I thought I still had. I asked to see my daughter before the paperwork moved forward. They allowed it. She sat across from me in a small interview room, her hands trembling, her eyes swollen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She finally whispered, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how far he planned to go. I thought it was just temporary. I thought we were fixing things." Her words cut deeper than anything her husband had ever said. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't a monster I'd imagined in my worst moments either. She was lost, desperate, and easily led by someone who saw my age as an opportunity. "I would have helped you," I told her quietly. "All you had to do was ask." Tears slid down her cheeks. I know, I was ashamed. There was no anger left in me, only grief for the years we'd never get back. When they led her away, she looked over her shoulder one last time. That glance carried every apology she couldn't speak. When I returned home, the house felt different. Lighter somehow, but emptier too. Justice had been served, but at a price I would carry alone. And as I closed the door behind me, I understood the final truth. Sometimes surviving the truth costs more than confronting it. The house was quiet the morning after I saw my daughter for the last time. I walked into my brother's study. The boxes delivered with his estate still sat, unopened in the corner. I had avoided them, thinking they would only stir old memories. But something pushed me toward them now, a feeling I couldn't explain. Maybe closure, maybe curiosity, or maybe intuition whispering that his story wasn't finished. I opened the first box and found folders, old photographs, a few handwritten notes. But at the bottom lay a small black envelope, sealed with wax, my name written on it in his unmistakable handwriting. The sight of it made my breath catch. Why would he hide something like this? And why give it to me only after his death? I broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single letter short, rushed, written with a trembling hand. Asterisk. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. There are things I've kept hidden for your safety. Don't trust anyone connected to my past. And don't use the key unless you're ready to face what I couldn't. Asterisk. A small brass key fell out and clinked onto the table. It was old, heavy, the kind meant for a lockbox or storage unit, not a house. My stomach tightened. My brother had been a private man, but this felt like fear, not privacy. As I reread the letter, one thought pressed harder than the rest. Whatever had pushed my daughter into desperation, whatever had poisoned the people around me, it might have started long before any of us knew. The brass key sat in my palm heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of years my brother never spoke about. I turned it over slowly, studying the worn grooves, the faint scratches along its edges. It wasn't a house key. It wasn't for a safe I recognized. This belonged to something older, something hidden, something he clearly feared. I unfolded the letter again, reading the last line over and over. Asterisk. Don't use the key unless you're ready to face what I couldn't. Asterisk. What had he been running from? My brother had always seemed confident, successful, calm. His sudden inheritance, his quiet life, his distant behavior, it all suddenly felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. I searched the rest of the box and found a small receipt tucked between old documents. A rental slip. A storage facility on the edge of town. Paid in cash. No forwarding address, no emergency contact. It was dated only 3 months before he died. My pulse quickened. Why would he hide a storage unit? What was inside that required a warning? As I sat there, the morning light shifted across the floor, catching the edge of a faded photograph buried among the papers. It was my brother, much younger, standing with a man I didn't recognize. The stranger's face was half turned away, but something about him made my skin prickle. I slipped the photograph and the key into my coat pocket. Whatever secrets my brother carried had not died with him. And as I locked the front door behind me, I knew there was no turning back. The truth wasn't waiting, it was calling. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of town, a long row of rust-colored doors stretching beneath a gray morning sky. It was the kind of place people used to hide what they couldn't keep at. Home, old memories, old mistakes, old versions of themselves. I handed the clerk the rental slip and waited as he checked the dusty records. His brow lifted slightly. Unit 47, he said. Hasn't been opened since the day it was rented. My fingers tightened around the brass key. My brother had never mentioned this place, never hinted at anything that needed hiding. When I reached Unit 47, the padlock looked untouched, coated with a thin layer of grime. The key slid in smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if it had been waiting for me. The door groaned as I lifted it. Inside, the light from the hallway spilled across stacks of boxes. each one marked only with dates years that meant nothing to me. But one metal case sat in the center of the room, unlike the rest, heavy, locked, and taped to the top was a small note in my brother's handwriting. Asterisk. If you're opening this, I'm gone. Be careful who you trust. Asterisk. I crouched beside it and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, legal papers, bank statements, photographs, and a folder stamped with a name I'd never heard before. The kind of file that felt dangerous just to touch. At the bottom lay one more photograph. My brother again, standing next to the same unknown man from the earlier picture. Only this time the stranger was facing the camera directly. Expression cold, eye sharp. And suddenly, I understood. My daughter's betrayal might have been only the surface of a larger storm my brother had spent his life trying to shield me from. I stared at the photograph of the stranger, his sharp eyes seeming to follow me even inside the dim storage unit. There was something unsettling about him, an intensity in his expression that felt less like a posed portrait and more like a warning frozen in time. My brother stood beside him, but his forced smile revealed tension rather than friendship. Whatever connected them wasn't trust. It was fear. I opened the folder stamped with the stranger's name. Inside were copies of wire transfers, handwritten notes, and what looked like surveillance. Photos, grainy images of my brother entering buildings at odd hours. Some of the documents referenced meetings, payments, deadlines. And then I found a single sheet torn from a notebook written by my brother. Asterisk. He found me again. If anything happens, follow the trail, but keep your distance. He knows about the inheritance. He knows about you. Asterisk. My breath caught. This wasn't about money my brother left behind this. It was about something he'd been tangled in long before. Something he believed would eventually reach me. I gathered the papers carefully, scanning each one like evidence from an old case. Several dates matched periods where my brother had suddenly disappeared from family gatherings. And the addresses listed on the documents weren't businesses, they were abandoned. Warehouses, closed offices, and private residences tied to no one on record. Whoever this stranger was, he had been a shadow in my brother's life for years. As I stepped out of the storage unit and locked it behind me, the uneasy feeling settled deeper into my chest. Someone else knew these secrets. Someone else had been watching him. And if my brother was right, then someone might be watching me now. Back home, I spread the documents across my dining table, studying each one with the careful eye I once used in court. Among the papers, a thin envelope slipped loose and fell to the floor. Inside was a single page torn from a foreign bank's ledger, an account under my brother's name, but with frequent deposits from someone listed only as asterisk R asterisk, no full name. No address, just two initials that carried too much weight. The transfers were regular, almost monthly, spanning nearly a decade. The amounts were large enough to raise suspicion, yet small enough to avoid most audits. My brother had been receiving money from someone he clearly feared, someone powerful enough to keep his identity hidden even from international systems. I checked the dates again, matching them against the timelines in the storage unit documents. Every deposit aligned with a note in my brother's handwriting. Asterisk, meeting completed. Asterisk, asterisk, agreement upheld. Asterisk, asterisk, no choice. Asterisk. Whatever he had been involved in wasn't voluntary. It was an obligation, a debt, or worse, a threat hanging over him. But one thing bothered me more than the money. The final deposit was made only a week before his death. After that silence, no withdrawals, no contact. As if the moment he died, the arrangement ended instantly. Why? I stared at the initials Arma, a chill crawling up the back of my neck. If this person was involved in my brother's final days, the truth might be darker than anything I'd imagined. As I leaned back in my chair, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. A deep voice spoke quietly, almost calm. "You shouldn't have opened that box." The call disconnected before I could respond. And suddenly, the threat my brother had feared wasn't in the past. It was here, and it knew my name. The phone slipped from my hand and landed on the table, the dull thud echoing through the quiet house. My heart hammered not from fear of the unknown, but from the realization that the unknown now knew *me. I replayed the voice in my mind, steady, calm, confident. A man who didn't threaten out of panic, but out of certainty. A man who believed I would understand exactly what he meant. I forced myself to breathe slowly and return to the documents. Somewhere in these papers was the truth he didn't want me to find. As I sifted through the stack again, I noticed one folder I had overlooked thin, labeled only with a date from 8 years ago. Inside was a police report. My brother had filed a complaint after being followed by an unknown individual, but the case had been closed for lack of evidence. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note from my brother. I'm watching again. Don't tell anyone. I studied the initials, tracing them with my thumb. RM wasn't just a name, he was a shadow, a presence powerful enough to keep my brother silent for years. And now he had turned his attention to me. Outside, a car slowed as it passed my house, its engine rumbling before moving on. I stepped back from the window instinctively. Paranoia or instinct? I wasn't sure anymore. I gathered the documents, locked them in my desk drawer, and slid the bolt on my front door. My brother had lived with this fear for years, and whatever he had been protecting me from was far from over. If RM believed he could scare me into stopping, he had forgotten one important thing. I had already survived betrayal from my own family. I wasn't about to run from a stranger. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every passing car, every shift in the wind felt sharper than usual, like the world had leaned in, listening with me. I sat in my armchair, the documents locked away but heavy in my thoughts. My brother had carried this burden alone. Now it sat squarely on my shoulders. Near midnight, a soft knock tapped at my door. Not urgent, not loud, just enough to freeze me in place. I approached carefully, staying to the side, and peered through the small gap at the edge of the curtain. A man stood on my porch shoulder, coat pulled tight, a hat shadowing most of his face. He didn't move, didn't fidget, just waited. For a moment, I thought it could be RM, but something held me back from calling the police. Instead, I spoke through the closed door. "Who are you?" A long pause, then a quiet reply. "Someone who tried to help your brother." The voice was rough, tired, but not the same one from the phone call. Still wary, I didn't open the door. "Why are you here?" He exhaled hard. "Your brother didn't trust many people, but he trusted me enough to ask one last favor. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should warn you." My stomach tightened. Warn me about what? Another pause longer this time. About the man he was running from. The man who doesn't stop. A chill ran through me. The stranger's silence was answer enough. I gripped the doorknob tighter. "What do you want from me?" His answer was simple, but carried a weight that settled deep in my bones. "To tell you the truth your brother died trying to keep buried." I unlatched the chain but kept the door only slightly open, just enough to see the stranger's face beneath the porch light. His eyes were tired, lined with years of worry, but they carried no malice, only urgency. Still, trust didn't come easily anymore. "Talk," I said. "From there." He nodded, understanding the distance. "Your brother wasn't involved in anything criminal," he began. "But years ago, he uncovered something he wasn't meant to see." I felt my pulse quicken. "What kind of something?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Financial laundering. High level, international." RM was. The middleman dangerous, untouchable, protected by people far above the system. The initials suddenly carried a weight far heavier than before. The stranger continued. Your brother stumbled into it by accident. Once he realized what he was looking at, he tried to report it quietly. That was his mistake. I gripped the doorframe. So, targeted him? Not at first, the stranger said. At first, it was warnings. Watching him, following him, reminding him that silence keeps you alive. And the money? I asked. Those monthly deposits? He paid your brother to stay quiet, the man replied. But your brother never spent a cent. He kept records, evidence. He planned to expose RM when he felt safe. Safe? I repeated, anger rising. He died before he could. The stranger looked at me with a heavy, haunted expression. Your brother didn't die of natural causes. The world seemed to tilt. Are you saying? He raised a hand. Listen carefully. RM thinks you now have what your brother hid. And he's right. That's why he called you. My breath caught. He wants the files, the stranger said quietly. And he won't ask again. His words settled into the silence like a blade pressed against my throat. I tightened my grip on the door, trying to keep my voice steady. If RM is that dangerous, why come here? Why not take the files to the authorities yourself? The stranger shook his head slowly. Your brother trusted you, not the system. He believed corruption reached too far up the ladder. If these documents fell into the wrong hands, they'd vanish, and so would you. I stepped back, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on my chest. I never asked for any of this. I had spent my whole life fighting for justice. But justice in a courtroom was different from justice in the shadows. This was a world without laws, without protections, where truth was currency and silence was survival. What does RM want from me? I asked. He hesitated. Not money, not loyalty. He wants compliance. He wants you to hand over everything your brother collected and disappear from the trail. So if I give him the documents, he leaves me alone? I asked. The stranger's expression darkened. Maybe, or maybe he erases you to make sure you never talk. A sickening realization washed over me. If RM believed I had the evidence, and he did, then my daughter, despite everything she'd done, could also be in danger. She was still tied to me, still a thread he could pull if he wanted leverage. The stranger saw the conflict in my eyes. You have two choices, he said quietly. Destroy the files and pretend none of this existed. Or expose him and risk everything left in your life. I looked past him into the night, the wind rustling the trees like whispered warnings. The truth was clearer than ever. Whatever decision I made next would shape the fate of everyone I cared about, even the ones who had hurt me. I closed the door just enough to gather my thoughts. The stranger still standing on the porch like a silent reminder that time was running out. His warning echoed in my mind: destroy the files and live in ignorance, or expose RM and risk everything. Neither option felt like survival. Both felt like endings. I walked to my desk, unlocked the drawer, and placed the folder in front of me. My brother's handwriting stared back at me from the first page, shaky but determined. Asterisk. If anything happens to me, follow the truth, but do not follow it alone. Asterisk. Not alone. I exhaled slowly. My daughter may have betrayed me, but she was still my blood. RM wouldn't hesitate to use her as leverage. Destroying the files wouldn't erase what he knew not anymore, and hiding would only delay the inevitable. I thought of my brother, how he spent years carrying this burden, how fear hollowed out his life. He didn't leave the key so I could repeat his mistakes. He left it so someone stronger, someone unafraid of the dark, could finish what he couldn't. I grabbed my phone and dialed the detective who had handled my daughter's case. When he answered, his tone shifted the moment he heard my voice. I need to report something, I said quietly, but not over the phone, and not to just anyone. The stranger outside watched me through the window, waiting for my decision. I opened the door fully this time. If you want the truth exposed, I told him. Then we do it the right way, with the right people, and we finish it together. For the first time, his shoulders eased. The path ahead was dangerous, uncertain, and far from over, but the final choice had been made. And I wasn't running.